Welcome to Enterprise Services Framework Tutorial Part 6. We are now at a point within our application where we can click on an employee within the grid, and our toolbar changes here as the employee is selected, where they can now specify to edit that employee's information. This is where we're going to focus our efforts on this tutorial. Right now we have some simplistic content, but we're going to go ahead and create a form-based layout and allow the user to change the employee information. Let's take a look at now the completed application. And when they click the edit, you will see that it pulls in the employee information and displays it in this table form layout rather than a grid layout. The information is filled in, which we display it in input boxes or drop downs, or where they can change the value with up and down arrows. And notice that they are formatted as dollars or as standard numbers, and we give them the option of choosing date pickers and so forth. The user can then choose cancel to close dialog box or hit save. So let's now take a look at Enterprise Services Manager, and we'll look at the data source that we'll be getting the information from. So when the user clicks on the selected employee within the grid, it's going to pull up a view from the employees cube called edit.emp. And this has on there the employee in the row and then the employee measures in the columns. Now what we're really going to be doing is we're going to be setting the individual employee that we're querying based on what is selected, so you're actually only going to get one row back, even though when I preview this I get more than one row. So let's now go to our application, and we're going to add this as a data source into our edit employee. Now in this module we currently just have some simplistic content, so we're going to go ahead and convert that to a module. And the data source that we need to query is called edit.emp, so we'll create that here. That will be edit.emp ds. And as we did with the employee grid before, that's the same thing. We use the method name. The method name is edit.emp, and that again comes from Enterprise Services. And what we need to do is pass a parameter that sets the employee ID to the one that we want to edit. Now that's done through parameters, and this puts a parameter on the URL. The parameter we want to specify is employee, because that's what the cube is defined as. And then what we can do is put in the employee ID that we want to work with. So employee 001. At this point, we're just going to hard code that, and we'll come back in later and set what that employee is. And it's going to come from the selected row from the employee management screen. Let's move now to the table that we need to build, and that's going to be in a form layout. So we're going to use table, and then we're going to define the rows. And let's now take a look at the employee dialog. So what we have here is that there are 4 columns. We have the first column is the label that you see here, the second column are the first inputs, the next one, and then finally the last one here. Now these are labels. This is an input, and this is an input which is displayed as a date picker widget. So let's go ahead and do that here. So we'll create 4 columns. The first column is going to be a label, and that just has in here employee name. Employee name. And this one is also a label, and that has the start date. So the field that we now need to put in here has to be an input field. So we use the standard HTML input. And what we need to do is to bind that field to the edit employee that we queried. And we do that through a field attribute. And then we specify the name of the field and the data source that it's bound to. So in this case it's edit emp_ds, which corresponds to this one here. And the data row, which is always the first row that we return. Since we're only going to be querying one employee, we will only get one answer back and one row back. And since this is a form and not a grid, we will need to specify it specifically here. Now the column name, employee name, and we do that with the second one as well. So we have another input here, field equals edit emp_ds, and the column in this case is employee start date. Now the difference here is that we want to render this as a date picker, and to do that we specify that using a widget attribute, and this will allow you to set it to ES date picker. So this is the first row that is created within that form. Let's do the second one, and this one is pretty much similar. It's just department, and the field in this case is department. This is actually end date, and that also is a date picker, so that's just end date. And then finally, since the department was not editable, we're going to change it to a label instead of an input. And this shows how you can actually bind a field to a label. So let's look now at the application. We have a little bit of changes to make here on the employee type. This row is a drop-down, and a drop-down does require a data source. So we're going to, instead of pulling these values full-time and part-time from TM1, which we can do, we're going to do it as a local data source. It will keep the performance up, and it doesn't really change that often, so we're pretty safe in doing that. And then we'll follow by hours per week, which is a numeric text box which has these little up and down arrows that can be used. So let's go back to our application, and we'll create a new row. This will be employee type. We will also bind the drop-down to a field in employee data set, which will be employee type. The end date is going to be changed to hours per week, and that is coming from the field employee hours per week. And the widget, instead of being a date picker, is going to be ES numeric, and that will give us that numeric input box. Now, as we mentioned, the drop down, which needs to be an input here, the drop down is requires a data source, and we're going to create that as a local data source rather than a method call, so we can simply just define that here as an array. So we'll create the array, and we can specify the ID is FT, and the name that you want to display on the drop-down is also going to be FT, so we'll display the same value. The ID for PT is going to display also as PT, but again, you can make that change here, and so when the drop-down displays, it will default and use this one as the display value and this one as the selected value. That selected value will then get written into the employee type field when the user makes that selection. So let's turn this input field now into a drop-down, and we do that through through a widget, and that widget is going to be specified as ES drop-down. And again, with the drop-down, we have to specify a data source, and that will just be the name of the data source that we created, which is type. Now, when a user is queried from TM1, we're going to get a value. So that means that the drop-down itself needs to be initialized with the value coming from the employee record. So we do that by setting the default equal to the field that we're going to be binding to. So this employee type here. When the query occurs, the default value will be pulled from the employee record, and that will be set as that drop-down. If we go back now to the application, we have left to fill in the employee title, the billable hours per week, salary, bonus, and so forth. What we'll be doing is basically the same thing, except we're going to be using an ES currency widget instead of an ES numeric widget. So let's go back to our source code here. I happen to have the remaining rows for this table that I can paste in. And again, they do the same thing we've been doing before. They create input fields which are bound to the values coming from the web service, and they're using widget ES currency instead of ES numeric. Let's go ahead and save this now, and let's go back to our application. Bring this up, and when we click on Robert Stevenson, now what we haven't yet done is connected what was selected from the grid to what gets queried, so it's only going to display the first one at this point, so James Goodman, but it is now pulling all the information in, and you can see it's set up in the way we've defined it. So let's go back to the application and let's take a look at what we need to do to connect the selection of the employee to the edit dialog module. So we do this by going into the employee management, and there's a number of ways we can do it. What we're going to do in this case is when the row is selected, we're going to set a application global variable to the selected employee. And so this starts off with app. Now app is created when ES framework is initialized, and you can use this for any inter-module communication. And because the selected employee is going to be used in many areas or for many modules, we're going to do it in this way. So I'm going to set up a variable called current employee in the application global namespace, and we're going to set the name equal to context. So when the row gets selected, that's going to be set on this context. So context.selected rows. Now a grid can have more than one selected row. In this case, we're only going to have one, and that would then be employee name, followed by the ID, which is context selected rows, and that is going to be simply just employee. So what happens now when that grid is clicked on, the row by the user, this will get set, and we can use this now in any subsequent module. And that needs to be a semicolon. Okay, so that's been set up. Now we can go back to our edit employee, and what we want to do is to start off the query of the employee based on what was selected. So simply need to put in app current employee .id. If I save this and go back to our application and refresh, now when I pick employee 3, Catherine, and choose edit, it will pull Catherine's information into the module data fields. So all we have left are to set up the styling and add some buttons. Let's go ahead and do that now. We go back to our application. Now we'll add those styles to our labels and our input fields. Let's do the labels first. We'll do them all at once here. Okay, and we'll add a class equals ESFormLabel. And then we'll add class equals ESFormInput. Okay, so that style, that's going to set up the styles for the button, for the input fields, and now let's go ahead and add in the buttons. And we're going to do that within a div so that we can control how they get placed. We're going to place a class on that one, and that is ESDialog. We'll call it ESDialogFooter. Okay, and then within there we're going to set up some buttons. And on click, so the first button we're going to set up is going to be the save button. So we'll edit employee, and that will be save. We'll use the save text on that one. Yes, and then we have a button and the command. We have an attribute command is close, so that will automatically handle the close function for us. And we're going to set up that button as a cancel button. Now let's go to the module. We're going to put in the on-click event for this edit employee. So right now we don't have any events in here. We'll go ahead and add in a new function. So this will be edit employee is what we called it. And that's a function. Okay, and what we want to do simply is just save the data source. So this .datasources, and that is edit empts save. Simple as that. That will commit all the changes that the user made in the form. And then finally we need to actually go ahead and close this dialog, and so we just need to specify this .close, and that will close the dialog. So we've set up the buttons to work at the bottom, and now we need to go ahead and add in the styles. So let's go to our app styles, and I just happen to have the styles available, so we'll paste them in here. So that's going to set up what the style looks for the dialog, for the form labels, the form values, setting the font weight and where they are positioned and how wide they are, and then the buttons and where they're going to be set up at. So now that we saved this, we can go back to our application and refresh it. And when it pulls up the employee information, the user can select the employee, click the edit button, and now you'll see that it places the styles that we chose, puts the cancel and the save on the right hand side like we have done in our completed app. This concludes part 6 of the Enterprise Services Framework tutorial.